Ion 71, T.H. Green's view on resistance to unjust laws. Introduction. T.H. Green and the Moral Foundation of Political Obligation. Thomas Hill Green, 1836–1882, a leading British philosopher of modern liberalism and the idealist school, redefined the concept of political obligation, that is, why citizens ought to obey the laws of the state. Unlike earlier liberals such as Hobbes or Locke, who based obedience on fear or contract, Green grounded it in moral consciousness. He believed that obedience to law is not a mere legal duty but a moral act arising from the individual's awareness that laws serve the common good. However, Green also recognized that not all laws are just or moral. Therefore, he asserted that when a law ceases to represent the common good and violates moral reason, citizens not only have a right but a moral duty to resist it. Thus, Green's theory bridges moral idealism and political realism, asserting that obedience to law is conditional upon justice. 1. The basis of political obligation in Green's philosophy. Green's view of political obligation emerges from his broader ethical philosophy that the state exists for the moral development of the individual. He rejected the negative or mechanical liberalism of Bentham and Mill, which viewed the state as a necessary evil. Instead, he saw the state as a positive moral institution, created to promote the common good and enable individuals to realize their moral potential. In his own words, the state is not merely a mechanism for restraining men, but a moral organization enabling them to realize a common good. Hence, we are bound to obey laws not because they are enforced by power, but because they express our collective moral will, what Green called the general will, similar in spirit to Rousseau's idea. 2. Green's concept of law and moral duty. For Green, laws are expressions of the community's moral consciousness. They are meant to secure conditions, peace, justice, education, welfare under which individuals can freely and morally develop. Obedience to law is thus a moral obligation because it is obedience to the moral purpose of society. However, this obligation is not absolute. It depends on whether the law truly promotes moral welfare. If a law contradicts justice or the moral sense of right, it loses its binding force. Green therefore distinguished between legal duty imposed by the state's power and moral duty arising from conscience and the sense of right. When these two conflict, moral duty must prevail. 3. Green's justification for resistance to unjust laws. Green held that the right to resist unjust laws arises from the moral supremacy of conscience over authority. He argued that there is no moral obligation to obey a law which is contrary to the moral ideal or which fails to promote the common good. In other words, if a law violates fundamental human rights, liberty, or justice, it forfeits its claim to obedience. Citizens, guided by conscience, may refuse compliance not for personal gain but to uphold the moral law. Thus, resistance is justified when 1. The law is morally wrong or oppressive. 2. It contradicts the true purpose of the state. 3. It obstructs, rather than promotes, human welfare and moral progress. Example: a law that sanctions racial segregation, slavery, or discrimination cannot claim moral legitimacy. Resisting such a law is an act of moral courage, not rebellion. 4. Conditions for legitimate resistance. Green was not an anarchist. he did not advocate reckless disobedience. For him, resistance to law is an exception, not the rule. It must meet certain moral and rational conditions. Moral justification. The law resisted must be clearly unjust, violating conscience or moral reason. 2. Common good, not self-interest. Resistance must aim to uphold justice for all, not to serve personal or sectional advantage. 3. Peaceful and responsible means. Resistance should be non-violent and conscientious, not destructive of social order. 4. Last resort. It should be undertaken only when all legal and constitutional methods have failed. Thus, Green's view anticipates the idea of civil disobedience, later developed by thinkers like Gandhi and Thoreau, emphasizing moral protest within limits of social responsibility. 5. The moral nature of resistance. Green saw resistance as a moral act, not a political rebellion. When citizens resist unjust laws, they are appealing to a higher law, the law of reason and morality. In this sense, obedience and resistance are both moral acts. Obedience is moral when the law serves justice. Resistance is moral when the law violates justice. Hence, Green's doctrine is not anti-law but pro-justice. It seeks to align legal obligation with moral reason. 6 examples illustrating Green's view. To understand Green's principle, it helps to apply it to historical and practical examples. Resistance to slavery. Laws in the 18th and 19th centuries permitting slavery were unjust because they violated human dignity. According to Green, moral individuals like William Wilberforce who resisted such laws were right, as they upheld the moral ideal of liberty. 2. Civil Rights Movement, USA. Martin Luther King Jr.'s nonviolent resistance to segregation laws in the 1960s exemplifies Green's principle, resistance to unjust laws for the sake of moral justice and human equality. 3. Indian Freedom Movement. Mahatma Gandhi's Satyagrah embodied the same idea that individuals must obey conscience above unjust laws, such as colonial ordinances. Gandhi's insistence on truth and nonviolence reflects Green's belief in moral, peaceful resistance for the common good. 4. Anti-apartheid struggle. Nelson Mandela's defiance of racial laws in South Africa illustrates that moral obligation transcends unjust political authority. 7. Philosophical connection, from Green to modern liberalism. Green's view marks a significant evolution in liberal political thought. Classical liberals like Hobbes and Bentham demanded obedience to preserve order. Green and the idealists added a moral dimension. Obedience must serve justice and spiritual growth. By asserting the moral right to resist injustice, Green linked liberalism with ethical idealism, influencing later thinkers such as Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., and John Rawls. His philosophy thus became the ethical foundation for modern democratic dissent, resistance not to destroy the state, but to restore its moral purpose. 8. Green's influence on later thought. Green's idea that resistance must serve the moral ideal of the state inspired later doctrines of civil disobedience and nonviolent protest. Gandhi's distinction between obedience to just laws and moral resistance to unjust ones closely mirrors Green's position. Even modern democracies recognize the right to protest as essential to maintaining moral legitimacy. For instance, peaceful protests against discriminatory or oppressive laws, example, apartheid, segregation, or gender inequality, are seen as expressions of civic conscience. Thus, Green's thought bridges law, morality, and conscience, essential pillars of ethical citizenship. 9. Summary for quick understanding. T.H. Green held that obedience to law is a moral duty, but only so long as the law promotes the common good. If a law is unjust or immoral, individuals have a right and moral duty to resist it peacefully and conscientiously. Such resistance should aim not at destroying the state but at restoring justice and moral order. Green's philosophy thus transforms political obligation from a legal command into a moral relationship between citizens and the state. Quick revision notes. Thinker T.H. Green, British idealist. View: state exists for moral development. Law moral when it promotes common good. Duty moral obligation to obey just laws. Resistance, moral right to oppose unjust laws. Conditions must be moral, peaceful, and for common good. Purpose, restore justice, not destroy authority. Influence, Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., and civil disobedience movements. Core idea, conscience is higher than coercion. One-line questions and answers for revision. 1. Who was T.H. Green? A British idealist philosopher and modern liberal thinker. 2. What is Green's basis of political obligation? Moral duty to promote the common good. 3. When is obedience to law justified? When the law serves justice and moral welfare. 4. What does Green say about unjust laws? They lose moral authority and may be resisted. 5. What should guide resistance to unjust laws? Conscience and the moral ideal. 6. How should resistance be exercised? Peacefully and for the common good. 7. What is the purpose of resistance? To restore moral order, not to destroy the state. 8. Which later movement reflects Green's idea? Gandhi's Satyagraha and civil disobedience. 9. What is the moral foundation of Green's view? Conscience is superior to legal command. 10. What does Green's view link together? Law, morality, and moral freedom. Final connection. T.H. Green's philosophy elevates politics from mere obedience to moral responsibility. He teaches that the state derives its legitimacy from justice, and when justice is denied, obedience becomes complicity. Thus, resistance to unjust laws, if guided by reason, conscience, and non-violence, is not rebellion but the highest form of civic virtue. In Green's vision, a citizen's ultimate loyalty is not to the law as it stands, but to the moral law that justifies all laws, the law of justice, truth, and the common good.